upon leaving his home, Steve Martin, who plays Nathan R. Johnson, the jerk of the title, needs adventure in his life. He needs a special purpose, which leads him to St. Louis. However, chaos, trouble follow him along his journey with plenty of outrageous scenes and huge belly laughs. Written by Steve Martin, who was at that point one of the biggest stand-up comedians in America. Not particularly well known in the UK. And I don't know if this did get a cinema release, but it became a home rental gem of a movie. I remember showing this to friends, and then we'd watch it again. It was that funny. Steve Martin plays a sheltered, simple-minded country boy. Upon deciding that he needs adventure, just leads him to the most bizarre episodic elements of this particular film. It is, beyond a doubt, one of the funniest films that you will ever see if you've not had chance. And when Andy said we need to revisit The Jerk, boy, he was right.
Yeah, I mean, this got added onto the deep dives list because I rewatched this last month just on a whim. It was one of them that you just go, you know what, I've not watched in ages. Early Steve Martin comedies. And so I dug out The Jerk, sat and watched it, and I was in hysterics from start to finish. And I was like, we need to talk about this film because this is a film that the idea of came from a stand-up routine that Steve Martin was doing. It was apparently the stand-up routine is on his debut comedy album, Let's Get Small.
Which I don't know if I still have, but I did have. I once picked it up in a record shop because nobody knew who Steve Martin was. I think it was like 50p. And again, I was just so engrossed by Steve Martin. I didn't know anything about him, but I just thought he was hysterical. That back in the day, that's what we did, folks. We used to have comedy albums of people stand
up. He claimed in his stand-up routine, one of his throwaway jokes was that he was born a poor black child, but once he heard his first Mantovani record, he decided to become white. And that's where the concept for this film came from, because you start the film with him being the white adopted child of a black family who doesn't realize that he's white. And like when he finally gets told he's adopted, his distress are like, you mean I'm always going to be this color? And then sets off to seek his fame and fortune in the big city. And along the way, every scene and every encounter ends with an absolute zinger. It's all based around the comedy. This isn't anything that the plot makes much sense because it's all done just to get a whole load of stand-up routines put together and make it hilarious from start to finish.
That used to be a thing when stand-ups would make the jump into either TV or movies. It would be predominantly based around some of their stand-up acts, and there are elements of this that run through the movie. Each one of his adventures is part of his stand-up. The banjo playing, cat juggling was one of the things that Steve Martin used to do on stage. And it worked, and it was comfortable territory for not only for Martin, but for those comedians who'd made that jump. You still see it occasionally now, but back in the day, that was pretty much how a comedian would make that transition.
You say the banjo playing, that beach scene, because there's a love story within this as well. There's the love element that develops between Bernadette Peters' Marie and Steve Martin as Navin. And there's a beautiful scene with them on the beach where he's serenading her. And then she takes out a trumpet and starts playing alongside. It's just the most bizarre love scene that you will ever see in your life. Bernadette Peters was... The part that she plays was written with her in mind. Steve Martin wanted her to be part of the film. And I think it works perfectly because the chemistry between the pair is magnificent.
She is a joy in this. And again, was one of those actors or entertainers that wasn't particularly well known on this side of the pond. She was big in musicals. She'd been big on stage. she was vivacious, and she steals, and so hard to do, every scene she's in with Steve Martin, because this sort of quiet innocence that she has is played out beautifully. I mean, I'm just thinking about this film, and I'm grinning like an idiot because it's just so ridiculously funny. It is Steve Martin at the top of his game as a stand-up, and it is just a joy. It's a joy of a film. It's ridiculously silly, but it once teamed up with the great Carl Reiner, who was famous for his work on the Dick Van Dyke Show and working with Mel Brooks on the 2,000-Year-Old Man. What a perfect combination, and they would go on to work together. But we'll discuss that in a moment.
Yeah, Carl Reiner himself pops up in this film in a brief but hilarious cameo as himself suing Steve Martin's Navin character after being plagued with becoming cross-eyed due to an invention that Navin came up with, which, as a director, his inability to sense depth means that he doesn't know when to call cut on action scenes, resulting in the deaths of some of his stuntmen. And I just love that absurdist nature of the director inserting himself in to have fun. The comedy is so well balanced in this as well, because there's throwaway scattershot lines that are just quick puns, but there's also well played out engagements that, like, it's a dialogue exchange, and then the payoff is brilliant. And then there's the lingering on a joke to such a degree that you start to think, okay, this is getting tired now, but then it comes back and gets you laughing again. And the best example of that is when his life's falling apart, he's losing all his riches, and he's got his pants round his ankles, and he's leaving the house going, I don't need any of this except that stapler. But aside from that, I don't. Oh, and that. And he starts picking up things one after the other. And you think, well, how long can this go on for? And then you start laughing again as he gets to the bottom of the stairs and grasps a chair and goes, and this chair, I need this chair. And then he turns around to say, and my dog. The dog growls at him and says, I don't need my dog, and then walks off. That whole sequence is, I was just creased from the start to the end, because it's Steve Martin riffing, and apparently, like, a load of the dialogue that he did in there, he was just riffing as he went along, and like occasionally would just pick up another item and just add that onto the list of things that he needs to keep. Marvelously done. The fact that it's then followed in wandering the streets of LA, still with his trousers around his ankles and his dressing gown on, it's just perfection of comedy. This is a comedian at the peak of his game, at the start of his game.
It is geniusly funny, and very different from the Steve Martin that we know now, because at that point he was riotously funny. He worked with Carl Reiner again, and I think the very early Steve Martin films will always be some of my favorites, because they are the most surreal and the most outrageous. They followed up with the brilliant, incredibly clever Dead Man Don't Wear Plaid, which was kind of spoofed in a beer ad in the UK, but they did it first, in which they combined old movies with a plot as Martin as a private detective. The Man with Two Brains, which is equally as silly as the previous films. And then All of Me. Did they do All of Me together?
Yes, All of Me was Reiner and Steve Martin.
And again, what a fantastic run. And then Steve Martin started to change direction in what he did, and didn't want to be the wild and crazy guy that he had been for so long, and moved into more. He moved into straight acting with Pennies from Heaven, which wasn't a huge success for him, but he also did LA Story. He did a run of family movies like Father of the Bride. He did the great Trains, Planes, and Automobiles. He did get silly again with Three Amigos.
Yeah, he kind of like tried to balance things out. I mean, he was always at his best when he was doing comedy, but yeah, he's one of those comedy actors that could do serious as well. The Father of the Bride series, like you've mentioned, 2 films there that are well worth seeing. But he then made quite a few bad choices. I mean, let's talk about the 90s when he did Sergeant Bilko. I mean, what was that about?
Yeah, the Pink Panther.
But he kind of made a comeback for me in 1999's Bowfinger, which we've got on our deep dive list to cover at some point.
Film.
And since then, he's kind of dipped in and out of doing, like, Cheaper by the Dozen was good, but Rat Race wasn't. And he's kind of lost that spark and magic. But whenever you still see him doing any stand-up stuff, and in recent years when he's done awards hosting skits and things like that, you can see that genius of comedy. And definitely in the past few years with Only Murders in the Building, we're starting to see that old Steve Martin charm coming back. And it's making me remember exactly what it was about Steve Martin that works so well. And if it wasn't for The Jerk getting him on the big screen for the first time, we wouldn't have things like Only Murders in the Building to look at and love immensely. The Jerk is just perfect absurdist comedy. There's not one scene that goes by that you're not at least chuckling. There'll never just be a smile on your face. There's always noise emanating from moments to moments, because it just goes in so many directions and just catches you off guard at any moment. Throw simple lines like when he finds out what his special purpose is for, and he writes home to tell them that he's found out what it is, and he wishes the whole family could have been here with him. And you need to see the film to understand what he's talking about there, but it doesn't leave much to the imagination. And the dialogue exchange of why are you crying and why are you wearing that old dress? I just heard a song on the radio that reminded me of The Way We Were. What was it? The Way We Were. That's just perfection. That's what makes this partnership with him and Rayner work so well. And over the rest of their 4 films together, it continued through. Like you say, Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid was just a genius concept. Man with Two Brains is very much like The Jerk. And All of Me was a touch more close to the sentimental comedy. Great stuff. The Jerk, if you've never seen it, track it down.
I've just remembered, actually, the first time I actually saw Steve Martin, and he was a guest on Parkinson promoting The Jerk. And Parkinson didn't know how to deal with him because the comedy was so out there. And he ended up with him cutting in half Michael Parkinson's tie. It might be out there somewhere on YouTube. Check it out. There were so many great performances from Steve Martin. I could name Roxanne, Simple Twist of Fate, his more darker turn in The Spanish Prisoner. But it is The Jerk if you want to see him at his most comedically brilliant. This 1958 British historical disaster, and I would go as far to say docudrama, is based on the eponymous titled book by Walter Lord. And it's the story of the Titanic as it sets out on its maiden voyage, carrying all the high-class people from Southampton to New York City. However, as everyone knows, things take a turn when warnings of an iceberg are ignored by the captain. With a great cast of some of the best in British luminaries. Kenneth More, Honor Blackman, David McCallum, the great Ronald Allen. This is, out of the two most well-known Titanic films, for me, the best one. Because, and you and I were talking about it before we started recording, because it tells a story about the passengers and the crew in a much more vast way than just focusing on the two characters in it. And there are some absolutely heartbreaking moments in this film. I remember seeing it as a child. I've not watched it recently. And really affecting me. One key sequence, which I know you're going to mention, really, really got to me. And it's portrayed as this sort of docudrama approach to it, which gives it a sense of realism. And even though it was a disappointment at the box office, it's incredibly well considered and well renowned.
Yeah, it's the most expensive film that was made in Britain at the time of its release. And like you say, the cast, I mean, is there anyone who was from the British film industry of that time that wasn't somewhere in here? I mean, even Desmond...
I've got Andrew Kears in there.
Michael Goodlife, Richard Leach, Lawrence Naismith, Desmond Llewellyn in a uncredited cameo as a gate steward. I
He
mean,
just has in a tiniest of roles that he doesn't even get a credit.
and it's not unlike. I mean, I'm not knocking Cameron's Titanic because technically that is a marvelous film, and the technical aspect and the dedication to showing an accurate sinking of the ship you cannot flaw. But as you've touched on, Titanic suffers by having a fictional coupling of Kate Winslet's character and DiCaprio's character with this onboard romance while the ship is sinking. And it kind of draws away from the actual tragedy, so that all the people who were caught up and real lives that were lost are just background elements. Now, it's worth noting that Cameron made Titanic because he was a huge fan of Night to Remember, and he wanted to make his version of that film. But Night to Remember is the much more engaging one because despite the fact there's a huge cast, the focus is never on any one particular person, and you get to know all the different players. You get to know the people who work on the ship. You get to know the people who are just passengers of all aspects of like low class to mid class to high class. And so you start to care. Even for people who you've only seen in one scene, you start to care. And this care comes from the dedication into research that they made before making this film. Yes, it drew from the book by Walter Lord, but they interviewed survivors of the disaster to get details accuracy. They did combine some characters together because you can't show everyone's story, but they combined a few, particularly of the ship's mates, etc. Were combined aspects of what four people did was combined into one. But they wanted to make sure that this was, like you say, a docudrama. It wasn't a fictionalized version of events. It was representing the actual events. And the ship, once again, like with Cameron's Titanic, more or less sinks in real time in the way that they believed it sank at the time. So the accuracy of the sinking was something key at the script writing stage, including the corners of every page of the script had the angle that the ship would be at that point in the film, because they'd shoot it, as with most productions, out of sequence. But they always knew that when they were shooting for certain scenes, like they tilt the cameras to 32 degrees, etc., just to make sure that it got the accurate depiction over time of how it all went down. This is an impact of the film. I rewatched it this week before bringing it to the show, and it hit me again. It's been decades since I last watched it. Like you, when I watched it as a child, it really upset me because it was.
Oh, I can remember watching it when I was a child. I wasn't a young child, I was still a kid, and it had an impact on me. And what I really like about this film is it avoids the melodrama that Cameron's film does. Now,
yes,
clearly, the second half of Cameron's film is the most interesting, which is the ship going down and how long it takes for the ship to sink. You're given the impression that it went down very quickly, but you go through seeing the turmoil, and that is for me the best part of his film. But with this, there's that historical accuracy to it. There's that sense of getting to know all and sundry, all passengers and crew alike. And it's a remarkable film, and it's incredibly moving, and it shows the warts and all approach to the people on the boat. Sometimes the callous and flippancy of some of the crew, and that strikes a nerve. Not everybody was at their best, but also you get to see the brave and the bold and those people doing good things, noble things, which really, really stand out. And I think it's that nuanced approach to it. It does feel now, looking back on it, it's almost has the beginnings of what has become the disaster movie staples. Multiple storylines, all told around a huge tragedy in stuff like the Poseidon Adventure and Irwin Allen's Towering Inferno. But I think this is the definitive telling. You can ignore all the TV adaptations, and there was a TV adaptation of this. I think it is the definitive cinematic telling of this particular tragedy.
It's got the emotional connection. It's got the heartfelt realization that some people would not survive. I mean, we all know the story of the bands that continued playing as the ship went down, and that is represented within this film. It was represented in Cameron's film because he literally lifted pretty much the same sequence in order to make his own film. And you've also got, and this is the scene that you were briefly mentioning before, a simple scene with a child that has lost his mother in amongst all the confusion.
Yes.
And a kindly old steward takes him initially to say, let's go and find your mother, but on the realization that they are not getting to a lifeboat and they are going to die, simply cradles the boy in his arm and soothes him, telling the boy, we will find your mother soon. And that is the emotional kicker of seeing people who have just accepted their fate, is that's the point at which they're going to die, but wanting to make sure that a child is not going to worry and giving him that last bit of comfort before he passes away. Whilst you've got the chaos going on with other people who are just barging past people, stepping over people, you've got that small glimpse of humanity just wanting to cradle someone and comfort them. And that scene broke me down. I had tears in my eyes at that scene watching it this week.
It is incredibly powerful, and I say, after probably 30 years since I've seen it, it still sticks with me. And that's one of the reasons I found it very hard to go back and watch this, because we don't need a fictional plot of characters who didn't really exist to tell this story, because the real drama, for good and for bad, the accuracy of this story, the sense of class and moral obligation and behaviors which are part of a class system are all represented here, and the tragedy that faced rich and poor alike. It's so well documented in this film, and the sense of accuracy, of course, makes it feel real and therefore more poignant.
As I said before, is they researched and interviewed many people who were survivors, and amongst the survivors and the advisors on the set were Fourth Officer Joseph Boxall, passengers Edith Russell and Lawrence Beasley. And during one day of shooting, Lawrence Beasley famously gate crashed the set. He infiltrated the set during the sinking scene, hoping to go down with the ship, but was discovered by the director, who ordered him off and vetoed the unscheduled appearance due to the actors' union rules. As Julian Barnes put it, for the second time in his life, Beasley left the Titanic just before it was due to go down. But those advisors were there for a reason, and it was to get that authenticity. We do know that director Roy Ward Baker is well known in the British film industry, particularly for his Hammer horror output.
Yeah, I was going to say he's best known for working in Hammer movies. For me, most notably, Quatermass, which he did fantastic. But he did work. He did work extensively in some of the 60s and 70s TV shows, but Quatermass and The Pit in particular is my favourite out of all the Quatermass films, and one of my favourite Hammer films of all time.
But this is a film that shows that he didn't just do horror and genre entertainment. He could really tap into a heartfelt tragedy, real life drama tragedy, and deliver it absolutely perfectly, with attention to detail. Like I say, as they knew at the time, they didn't know that the ship split into two during the sinking at that point in time, so it was representing what was known from the survivors' testimonies. This is a marvellous film. A Night to Remember is one to definitely check out.